Jean Piaget, a cognitive theorist whose work was based on observing his children and grandchildren, claimed that in order to understand behavior, we needed to describe it thoroughly. We believe that in order to understand the brain, it is also important to understand what it is. In this chapter, we will learn the names and locations of its major parts and how they are connected to one another. In advance, John Pinnell, the author of our book, apologizes for the lack of foresight displayed by our earliest neuroanatomist, as their choice of names for neuroanatomical structures is often difficult for individuals who may speak English only. Most of the names are in Latin and Greek, and so you will hear various pronunciations of the same name across different disciplines and by different people. So just know that ahead of time. In this module, we will study the general layout of the nervous system, looking specifically at the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and their derivative branches. The nervous system is a complex collection of nerves and specialized cells known as neurons that transmit signals between different parts of the body. It is essentially the body's electrical wiring. Structurally, the nervous system has two components: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, whereas the peripheral nervous system consists of sensory neurons, ganglia, and nerves that connect to one another and to the central nervous system. Functionally, the nervous system has two main subdivisions. That is what we call the somatic and the autonomic. Both subdivisions are made up of afferent nerves and efferent nerves. It is important to note that the afferent nerves are our sensory nerves, and these carry sensory signals from the internal organs to the central nervous system, whereas the efferent nerves are the motor nerves, and these carry motor signals from the central nervous system to internal organs. To differentiate the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system further, please note that the somatic nervous system is the one that controls our voluntary movements and behaviors, whereas the autonomic nervous system is what controls the involuntary movements. For example, the autonomic nervous system regulates certain body processes such as blood pressure and the rate of breathing and the work that without conscious effort is made by your body, whereas the somatic nervous system would control things that you and I engage in intentionally. If you choose to walk across the room at this point, it would be a voluntary decision, and you would then activate the nerves that are necessary to move your muscles and get you across the room. Additionally, the efferent nerves of the autonomic nervous system have another subdivision. It's broken up into two, and that's what we call the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. These are involved in the fight or flight response, whereas the sympathetic nervous system gets our body ready for action, and this includes several body changes such as the dilation of pupil and the heartbeat increasing and the inhibition of activity in our intestines. The parasympathetic nervous system calms us down after the threat has passed. Essentially, the parasympathetic nervous system reserves our energy so that it can be used when there are emergency situations. This is what we call the fight or flight response. Please note that this is under the autonomic nervous system. Therefore, a lot of the changes that our body undergoes, and I'm referring to physiological changes, are not something you and I control. As you may remember, autonomic nervous system is for involuntary components, whereas somatic would be voluntary. Here we can appreciate the general layout of the nervous system. Please note that in yellow, we can see and appreciate the various nerves all over our body. And you can see that they're distributed all throughout. Any sensation would be then sent over to the central nervous system, which is in purple here, and that is made up of the brain and spinal cord. And we could see that, as stated earlier, the afferent nerves, which would be the sensory, would be taking the message over to the spinal cord, and then from there it would then be sent over to the brain. The brain would then send a message back down, and that would be the motor or efferent nerves, and these would carry the signals from the CNS onto the body part that would be handy in taking care of an issue. For example, if you feel a mosquito in this part of your arm, then there would be an activation of the afferent nerves, which are sensory. It would send the message over here. It would then be sent to the brain. The brain would then respond by activating and sending efferent nerves, our motor, that would then activate this arm so that it could take care of the mosquito that is here. Again, the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system is located outside the skull and the spine, and it serves to bring information into the CNS and also carry signals out of the CNS. The autonomic nervous system has two kinds of efferent nerves: sympathetic nerves and parasympathetic nerves. The sympathetic nerves are autonomic motor nerves that project from the central nervous system, more specifically from the lumbar, which is a part in our back that pertains to the abdominal segment of the torso, and the thoracic region of the spinal cord. Thoracic, Thoracic, and that pertains to the chest area. The parasympathetic nerves are those autonomic motor nerves that project from the brain and sacral region of the spinal cord. Sacral, S-A-C-R-A-L, and this pertains to the lower back. It is important to note that all sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves are two-stage neural paths. The sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons project from the central nervous system and go only part of the way to the target organs before synapsing on other neurons. You can think of this two-stage neural paths as a relay race, whereas there isn't only one racer, one runner that could cross the finish line, and instead it takes a teamwork of neurons that would carry the baton to a certain distance. Looking at the diagram that we looked at earlier, you can visualize the brain sending an efferent nerve and projecting to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, it would then relay onto another nerve that would carry it over to the arm so that you could swat away the mosquito that's on your left arm. As similar as the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are, they do differ in that the sympathetic neurons that project from the central nervous system synapse on second-stage neurons at a considerable distance from their target organs, whereas the parasympathetic neurons that project from the central nervous system synapse closer to their target organs on very short second-stage neurons. You can look at Appendix 1 of your textbook to understand this further. Essentially, the sympathetic division serves the purpose of energizing, organizing, stimulating, and making use of resources when there are threatening situations. That would be the fight or flight response. This is an indication of a psychological arousal that would get you ready for action. Whereas the parasympathetic, which projects from the cranial and sacral regions of the spinal cord, they would then serve the purpose of helping you rest and restore. And this would be indicative of psychological relaxation. Please note that ideally you would spend a lot more time on a parasympathetic stage, as if you were to spend more time on sympathetic, you'd be more alert and more aroused on a regular basis, which is not healthy. Additionally, you would likely be tired most of the time. If any of you have ever experienced anxiety attacks, you may be able to relate to the fatigue that is experienced after an anxiety attack or panic attack. Individuals who have panic attacks basically had an activation of the sympathetic division, and after the threat is gone and they realize that things are okay, the parasympathetic kicks in and you are able to then rest and restore the body for when another threat occurs, typically leaving the individual sleepy and tired.